Oh, hi there. I was told that you were interested in facts and logic and biology and that kind of thing. This is the perfect place to be. We're going to be talking all about biology, facts, and reason and logic and all that wonderful stuff today. So get comfortable.
Save our children! Save our children! Save our...
So let's talk about sex. And not sex as in like fucking. I've already beat that subject to orgasm far enough already on this channel. I'm talking about the XYs and the XXs. And the XXYs and the XYYs and the XXXs and the XXYYs and the XXXYYs and the XXXXs and the XXXXYs and the XXXXX. Fuck! So what actually constitutes biological sex? Well, the Oxford Languages Dictionary describes sex as either of the two main categories, male and female, into which humans and most other living things are divided on the basis of their reproductive functions. Now, this definition isn't particularly scientific. The actual complexities of sex are insane. So if you want a very in-depth definition on sex made by an actual biologist, I highly recommend watching this video. That'll go more into the complexities of sex, like on a chromosomal, cellular level, including fancy words like genomes and dimorphic. But in terms of the observable characteristics that we fembos commonly associate with sex, above the cellular chromosomal level, sex characteristics include genitals, nose size, cheek fat, forehead size, brow ridge and position, hairline, lip size and position, chin and jaw size and position, bone size and structure, height, fat distribution, hip size, muscle size and development, libido, mood and personality, breast size, body and facial hair growth and placement, skin softness, Adam apples, and voices. And that's not even all of the traits associated with sex. That's just a lot of the external, very observable, kind of like commonly known ones. There are other less easily observable things associated with sex, like brain structure. Sex characteristics are generally divided into primary and secondary traits, primary being those that you're born with and secondary being those that you develop through the process of puberty. The human race is generally seen as dimorphic or having two sexes, wherein individuals born with XY chromosomes have a certain collection of primary and secondary sex characteristics, and those born with XX chromosomes have a wildly different collection of primary and secondary sex characteristics. Now, unless you have undergone a brain scan and had your genes tested and analyzed by a genetic specialist, you probably have no idea what your chromosomes actually are or all of the intricate details of your sex.
XY detected!
This was an actual tweet directed at me on Twitter. I'm often perceived to be an XY by the outside world. But the reality is, I have no idea what my chromosomes are, and transphobes are not, in fact, very cheap digital replacements of a genetic test. Y'all don't know what chromosomes I have, and neither do I. But chromosomes aren't the only difficult to observe aspects of sex. I mentioned brain structure earlier, and that can also vary wildly in trans and queer individuals, often unrelated to chromosomes. So for example, trans men and trans women would generally have the associated brain structure as the gender they identify as, even without undergoing hormone replacement therapy. But they may still have the chromosomes of the gender that they were assigned at birth. The reality is that most humans are born with an insanely complex conglomeration of sex traits, and those traits can often wildly diverge from traditional notions of what sex characteristics are meant to be. In fact, most people will find themselves diverging from a strict sex binary with at least some of their secondary sex characteristics. Now, you might be wondering why I haven't brought up intersex people, and certainly intersex people are relevant to a conversation on how sex isn't binary. And the main reason I haven't brought them up so far is because of this. Hi, my name's Maddie Nymerica, and my pronouns are attack helicopter. It's basic human biology, really. I mean, God made man, and he made man's servant. The human species is sexually dimorphic, and rare genetic anomalies don't disprove that. I'm sorry if you want to identify as an alien freak, but facts don't care about your feelings. I'm actually something of a biologist myself. I once had a conservative say to me, "You wouldn't say that humans have 6 toes just because some people have 6 toes." And I wanted to respond with, no, of course not, what a silly false equivalence logical fallacy. 0.001% of the population are born with extra digits, whereas over 2% of the human population are born neither male nor female in terms of physical, factual, biological sex. But really, what I would say is that, yes, some humans do have extra digits. And actually, quite a few humans are intersex. There are as many humans who are intersex that there are humans who have green eyes. I have green eyes. You wouldn't say, however, that I am a genetic anomaly. You would say that some humans have green eyes. And that isn't even a false equivalence logical fallacy, that's almost perfectly analogous. Now I'm going to talk more about the intersex community in part 2 of this video, but I don't even need the intersex community in my argument to prove that sex isn't binary. All I need is a cisgender community and the billion-pound plastic surgery industry, which frequently offers gender-affirming services to cisgender people who also find themselves desperately attempting to alter their sex characteristics to be better at their assigned sex. Men are regularly born with gynecomastia or breast development, and women are regularly born with traditional male-patterned hair development. And a lot of these folks aren't even labeled as intersex. We're just talking about cisgender people who deviate somewhat from assigned gendered expectations. If you're a girl and you're tall, congratulations, but you're failing at your assigned biological sex. But also, call me. If you're a man and you have long eyelashes and hips, sorry pal, but you're really doing the whole male sex thing incorrectly. Every gender has nipples, but some are seen as male or female based on pretty much no actual science. Both men and women are born with mammary glands capable of producing milk. Even looking at genital makeup in terms of nerve endings and components involved, they're almost identical. Now, nobody would tell a cis woman with facial hair that she's not a real woman, but the moment trans women have a single hair left untouched by hair removal, it's a sure sign that they are, indeed, just men, and they always will be. Many cisgender individuals will undergo extensive surgical and non-surgical procedures to change their sex characteristics to be more in line with traditional societal notions of how their sex should manifest. And generally speaking, society doesn't have any problem with this as long as the individuals involved identify with the gender that they were assigned at birth. If you're a man with larger than average for men breasts, society's like, no problem, dude, we'll take care of those for you for free. But if you're assigned female at birth and you want the same thing, society's like, go fuck yourself. So no, sex isn't binary, and it isn't binary for any of us, intersex or otherwise. But now here's another question. Is it changeable? And I mean, yeah. If you're truly interested in engaging with the realities of science and biology in good faith, then you have to acknowledge that sex is, at least to a certain degree, changeable. Amongst the sex changes I mentioned earlier, genitals, nose size, cheek fat, hairline, lip size, height, fat distribution, hip size, muscle size and development, libido, mood and personality, breast size, body and facial hair growth and placement, voice size and skin softness are all changeable via undergoing hormone replacement therapy, or HRT. That means that, combining testosterone-based and estrogen-based HRT, 71% of sex characteristics are modifiable and in some cases completely changeable via HRT, give or take a couple of percentages based on whether you're transmasc or transfemme. Now, with the sex characteristics remaining, all are modifiable via surgery apart from chromosomes, which is to say that according to this example, 95% of your primary and secondary sex characteristics can be completely changed via a combination of surgery and HRT. So yes, transphobes, there is some degree of your biological sex that is immutable and unable to be changed. And it happens to be the part of your sex that is invisible to absolutely fucking everyone, and has pretty much no real relationship with how we engage with sex or gender in society. But yes, even though 95% of your sex can be changeable, that 5% of you will always truly be, probably, at least like a little bit connected to the sex you were assigned at birth, but also maybe not even then, because chromosomes are weird and don't even always have a direct impact on our sex development at all. But, take that, libs. Now, there's another element at play here which I think is really important to talk about, and that's the aesthetics of sex and gender. Even if your sex has changed physically and biologically, your sex might not look like it's changed. In the trans community, there's a term called passing, which is used for trans folks who are perceived correctly as their gender. If trans folks don't pass, it's very hard for them to be taken seriously as their gender. Yet if a cis woman looks conventionally like a boy, gender criticals would never say, actually no, that's a boy. I mean, that's not true actually, they do say that all the time, especially when they're failing at being transphobic. In fact, this happened very recently with a very prominent case in M&S.
Today I experienced something I've never experienced before, and it was absolutely disgusting. I'm a girl, so I went to go to use the women's toilet, where she then was not happy that I was in the women's toilet because she was disagreeing with the fact that I was a woman.
Women suffer from this all the time. Women are often perceived as men, and it must be very unfortunate for them. There's a huge double standard here where people will get angry with trans women for playing into gender stereotypes and making a mockery of womanhood by expressing themselves in stereotypically feminine ways, because biology is all that matters. Yet when the biology involved actually confirms the trans person's sex or gender, transphobes are happy to ignore that because, well, they don't look like a girl. So which one is it? If you care about the integrity of sex categories, and you care about the language that we use to describe sex categories and gender, then surely someone with 5% of a scientifically defined male sex and 95% of a scientifically defined female sex should be categorized as female. I was never great at maths, but someone check me on that. I'm pretty sure that one works out. What I want to make clear here is that sex is changeable and not binary, but I'm by no means saying that you need to change your sex to receive validation in the gender that you identify with. I'm not trying to play into trans medicalist arguments here. I'm a trans person who is medically transitioning, but I don't believe that you need to medically transition to be trans or to identify with a certain gender. I don't believe you need to have a certain percentage point in a sex to be able to claim a gender category. However, what's really important here is that a lot of the world does still see sex and gender as the same thing, and what we need to make clear is that sex is not binary and that it is changeable. While we're on the topic of medical transition and surgery, it's worth noting that even though trans people can change their sex and sex is changeable biologically, it might not be changeable for social and financial reasons, like living in an environment where that is not possible or their safety is at risk, or as well just simply not being able to afford to. I highly encourage you to support the trans people in your community. I'm a strong believer in mutual aid. On that note, I am one such trans person that you can throw some money at. I find it interesting that transphobes are the ones desperately clinging to traditional sex categories, yet are happy to completely ignore the realities of sex changes, such to where they'll go out of their way to describe fully bearded muscular men as women and big booby girls as men. And as a gender anarchist, I'm all for that. But y'all are the ones running around screaming that words matter.
There are not two sexes. There are n sexes. There are as many sexes as there are assemblages, and since each of us enters into several assemblages, each of us has n sexes. When children discover that they are reduced to one sex, male or female, they discover their powerlessness. They lose the machinic sense and are left only with the signification of a tool. And then the child really does fall into depression. They have been damaged. Their countless sexes have been stolen.
Intersex definition is a person who is born with a combination of male and female biological traits. So let me get this straight. Intersex includes anybody with a combination of male and female biological traits. But as I mentioned in part 1, that's potentially quite a lot of us. Now I realize I'm starting to sound a little bit like people who tell me, oh yeah, I'm also really into cleaning when I mention that I'm OCD, and I'm like, no, Karen, you do not have the same medically diagnosed mental fucking illness as me. I don't want to invalidate the lived experiences and oppression of intersex people, which, by the way, is fairly significant. Intersex individuals can fall victim to infanticide, abandonment, mutilation, and neglect. They are often labeled as individuals with birth defects or disorders which need to be fixed. Non-consensual surgeries of intersex people are still practiced today, which can include the removal of reproductive organs, alteration of external and internal genitalia, and subjection to prepubescent hormonal therapy to force their bodies to develop in certain expected ways. Some people have also had their intersex status deliberately withheld from them by doctors and parents. As a result of these practices, intersex people can face a lifetime of dysphoria and medical problems. Some will be left with permanent damage to their bodies which make orgasm impossible just to conform to an aesthetically normal model of whichever sex their parents and doctors deem they should be trying to fit into. Now, where have you heard genital mutilation and forced hormone therapy and an inability to orgasm before? Oh, that's right, you've heard it from transphobes. Transphobes love to misdescribe trans medical journeys as as child abuse, genital mutilation, and they love to highlight things like inability to orgasm and changes to the body that are permanent and medical. And these are mostly just wildly inaccurate descriptions of trans-related surgeries and medical journeys. Trans people can have orgasms and do have amazing sex lives, but it's interesting to see the comparison here. The intersex community often are victims of alterations to their body and sex which force them to fit into more traditional ideas of what sex is supposed to be. So actually, where we do see genital mutilation, non-consensual surgeries, forced hormone therapy, inability to orgasm, and all of these really horrific things, we actually see it by the normative world trying to force people into certain sexes. Transphobes will accuse the trans community of doing all these horrible things that we're not doing, while doing all those horrible things themselves to members of our community that are not of a binary sex. It's beyond horrific how badly intersex people are treated in society, and I think those that are intersex need to be fought for and need language that is unique in describing their oppression. But that said, by literal definition, quite a few of us could potentially be intersex as well, simply by textbook definition, especially if we involve secondary sex characteristic variations. Many of us have at least one secondary sex characteristic which is going to deviate from supposed male or female sex attributes. And I'm just talking about those of us who visibly in some way aren't a perfect scientific definition of the male or female sex. Pretty much none of us have our chromosomes tested at birth, so it's illogical to assume that there is quite an insane amount more intersex folks out there than we're even aware of. And we're already aware that there's approximately 2% of the population who are intersex, which makes intersex people as common as those with green eyes or ginger hair. So no, intersex folks aren't a genetic anomaly. They're a pretty statistically significant group of the human population, and are probably even more statistically significant than we realize. Now, the main notable difference between statistically significant groups who have green eyes or ginger hair and those who deviate from the expected dimorphic male-female sex norm is that those who deviate from assumed sex norms pose a threat to the societal status quo. Michel Foucault examines in his work on biopower the concept that biological categorizations are essentially used to put people into controllable boxes. By documenting things like population, number of births, life expectancy, public health, housing, migration, crime, and which social groups are overrepresented in deviations from the norm. And then society uses those very biological studies to try to adjust, control, or eliminate deviations from the norm.
Si tu n'es pas comme tout le monde, alors tu es anormal. Si tu es anormal, alors tu es malade. Ces trois catégories, ne pas être comme tout le monde, ne pas être normal et être malade, sont en vérité très différentes, mais ont été réduites à la même chose.
Gender criticals like to move quickly on from the intersex argument, not only because it threatens the position that sex is binary, but also because they don't really want to know that intersex people exist. They don't want to talk about intersex folks' needs, their rights, or even their mere often hidden presence in our society. Abigail Thorne introduced me to the concept of doxastic anxiety in one of her video essays, a term which essentially refers to the fear of learning information which could affect your secure, comfortable worldview. And I think there's a lot of that happening with sex. If we become aware of how many intersex people exist and how they're a fundamental part of the human experience, and how we might even be included in that population ourselves, it tears apart our worldview on sex and, by extension, gender. And from a power perspective, it makes the populace more difficult to control. If you consider that a lot of gendered construction in the modern day resulted from capitalistic ad campaigns in the 1900s, convincing women to shave their legs or people to buy shampoo to the scent of deodorant were allowed, gender is quite literally a massive profit machine in the world. And if we say that gender isn't real, we challenge that. But if we say that sex isn't real, we have to radically reform the way that we view so many aspects of the human experience and how we structure society. And naturally, many of those in power have an enormous vested interest in preventing that from happening. Non-consensual surgeries practiced on intersex people are literally called normalizing surgeries. Intersex people do not need to be fixed because not fitting perfectly into a male-female dimorphic sex isn't wrong. It's not a defect, it's just a result of human sex not being, well, binary. Pretending intersex people don't exist or that they're not relevant to the conversation on sex and gender is erasing the exception. And erasing the exception is not only a logical fallacy that you shouldn't use, but it's also kind of fundamentally unethical. No human, whether an anomaly or a statistically significant group, should be erased at any time, and intersex people deserve a lot better than they're getting in society at the present moment.
Labeling someone a man or a woman is a social decision. We may use scientific knowledge to help us make the decision, but only our beliefs about gender, not science, can define our sex. Furthermore, our beliefs about gender affect what kinds of knowledge scientists produce about sex in the first place. Our bodies are too complex to provide clear-cut answers about sexual difference. The more we look for a simple physical basis for sex, the more it becomes clear that sex is not a pure physical category. What bodily signals and functions we define as male or female come already entangled in our ideas about gender.
In the late 18th to early 19th centuries, society switched from a unisex to a binary sex model. Previously, men and women were seen as different subtypes of the same sex. It was believed men and women had the same sex organs, but that masculinity was defined by hot temperature and femininity by cold temperature, with the sun and the moon representing these differences in temperature and sex. The vagina was seen as an internal penis, the ovaries as testicles, and the womb as a scrotum. Aristotle argued that sex was a cosmic principle and that sex organs were mere instruments. The models established to paint men and women as complete opposites only came about in the early 1800s, around the same time that those very same models were being established to show the biological difference in race. These sex differences were then used to employ nature as the reason for women to stay at home and men to have increased powers in society. In the early 20th century, science was upholding the idea that there was no biological basis for the sex binary. In fact, many scientists even believed that humans were naturally bisexual, love that, and also that all humans were, to a certain degree, naturally intersex. It wasn't until 1955 that Johns Hopkins physician John Money coined the terms gender role and gender identity as part of his exploitative research on intersex children. This concept of gender reinforced the sex binary and made it more difficult to uphold theories that humans were naturally bisexual and that all humans were to a certain degree intersex. These theories of gender also ended up being used to uphold racist white nationalist views. The clear distinction of a sex binary was one of the ways in which the Western world distinguished itself from the so-called savage nations of the rest of the world. Suffragists were actually called a third sex for threatening gender norms in the early 1900s. They were labeled psychologically abnormal and evolutionary throwbacks that possessed the feelings and desires of a man. Our societal relationship with sex, similarly to gender, is deeply intertwined with power structures and cultural attitudes. Yes, there are biological components to sex that we can measure and understand, and the human species, like many other animal species, is largely, although certainly not completely, dimorphic. But that doesn't mean that sex is purely biological either. As we've explored throughout this video, many of the characteristics assigned a male or female sex are heavily influenced by our current historical ideas of gender. Like, yes, biologically speaking, women tend to have bigger lips than men, but there are enough men with larger lips than enough women to where saying that lip size is an immutable aspect of biological sex isn't really useful. What's more accurate is to say that, as a secondary sex characteristic, a lot of women tend to develop larger upper lips and fuller lips than a lot of men. But anything more specific than that isn't really scientifically sound. We, as a society, have to ask ourselves what about our classification of sex characteristics is useful or relevant for our human experiences. If they're broad generalizations with an enormous number of exceptions that are also largely formed around our existing construction of gender, what use is it to say holistically that women have big lips and men small ones? If it's not scientifically sound, then what value does it provide, if not to reinforce societal views on gender? Why do we say that one nipple deserves censorship and the other doesn't, when scientifically speaking, the sex makeup is relatively the same? It feels as if sex is the weapon of gender, the supposed biological construction to reinforce the gender categories that were assigned at birth. And intersex and trans folks threaten its scientific validity and ultimately the gendered categories of control. Before getting up in arms about sex categories being threatened, we should first ask ourselves what about our rigid sex categorizations in place in society is useful. Yes, we need to recognize the current and historical oppression of certain groups. Yes, we need to understand biology to provide appropriate medical care. But all of these things can be done by examining humans as holistic creatures of complexity rather than limiting labels. Having predominantly estrogen or testosterone in your body changes you in drastically different ways, and it's valuable to understand those differences. But your sex category has absolutely no bearing on what toilets you can use or how you should interact with the wider outside world. Most sex divisions in society are just relics of Victorian patriarchal sex category controls. Women didn't even used to have public bathrooms because, well, women don't even need to leave the house, do they? But now, women's public bathrooms are a regular in newspaper headlines around the world. All the damn time. My purpose here isn't to distract you from the wonderful world of science and biology we talked about in part 1. I'm just hoping to create awareness that not everything is as deeply rooted in scientific explanation, and not everything needs to be. Dr. Fausto-Sterling, in her book Gender Politics and the Construction of Sexuality, argues we should stop looking for universal causes of sexual behavior and gender acquisition, and instead study the interaction between bodies and environments over time. She asks the question, how might genetic variability interact with environment stimulus to produce anatomical difference? For example, we could investigate how cultural norms that specify that girls wear dresses but not boys produce gender and sex differences in some types of motor skills. We could understand gender like nitrogen, oxygen, or carbon dioxide as one of the predominant atmospheric elements that shapes body and consciousness. The idea that gender and sex is an ongoing process of materialization embraces spectrum and complexity. That's why it's deprioritized in a world that requires fixed identity for birth certificates, bathroom signs, and government identity forms. Transphobes like to say that they're the side of truth and science, whilst the left who support trans folks are on team delusion. Yet transphobes are the first to deny science and biology when it doesn't support their tirade of hatred. If we're interested in truth and facts and science, we need to examine the history of sex and gender, the science behind both, and how society, especially modern-day capitalism, has used both as a tool for control. Anyway, I think this has been quite enough of Quinn ranting about gender for one video. If you'd like to support the continuation of my creative work, as well as my own transition and attempts at surviving this capitalist hellscape, I'd be really grateful if you could support me on Patreon. I've posted my sources for today's video in the description if you're interested in further exploration on this topic. I'll end this video by saying, please spread love and kindness wherever you can. Love the queer and trans folks who just want to exist in this society, love difference, love those who step outside the norm. And I will see you in my next video. That is amazing to hear. We are going to talk all about biology and facts today. Oh my god, this is so cringe. What do you think? Am I pulling off the repressed Victorian vibes here? Just an innocent Victorian girl, not showing my ankles.